September 2025, Madison County, Iowa. By 6:30 on Saturday morning, 35-year-old Mara Whitaker had already counted the money in her checking account 3 times. It was not enough. Not for the tractor payment. Not for the property tax bill sitting unopened on the kitchen counter. And definitely not enough to repair the collapsing barn that had belonged to her grandfather before it became hers. Mara stood behind that barn in muddy work boots, faded jeans, and a gray canvas jacket, staring at something nobody in the county had cared about for 70 years. A wall of brush, honeysuckle, wild grape, dead sumac, volunteer trees. 7 decades of tangled growth had swallowed nearly half an acre behind the barn, and every summer it became taller, darker, and harder to reach. Her neighbor, Dale Mercer, had laughed when she told him she planned to clear it. You'll spend more clearing that mess in the ground is worth. Mara hadn't argued. She rarely did. She simply looked at the weeds again. There was something underneath them. She had seen it 3 times that summer. A straight line where no straight line should have been. The first time, she thought it was an old fence. The second time, she thought it was the remains of foundation. The third time, after a thunderstorm flattened part of the brush, she saw 2 pale stones sitting exactly beside each other. Mara had crouched there and brushed away wet leaves. There had been a third stone beneath them. Then the brush closed over it again. So on Saturday morning, with her 8-year-old daughter still asleep inside the farmhouse, Mara made a decision. She was going to burn the dead growth, not recklessly, not illegally. She had checked the county's agricultural burning requirements, called ahead, waited for a calm morning, and kept a water tank, hose, shovel, and tractor nearby. Her grandfather's old Ford 8N sat beside the barn. The tractor was nearly 70 years old itself. Its paint had faded to a dull red, and one rear fender had been repaired with a piece of steel that didn't match. Grandpa Whitaker had bought it used in 1963. Mara had learned to drive it before she was tall enough to comfortably reach the pedals. Now she climbed onto the seat, turned the key, and waited. The engine coughed. Once, twice, then it caught. The old machine settled into a rough, familiar rhythm. Mara glanced toward the farmhouse. Her daughter, Lily, appeared at the upstairs window. "Mom." Mara lifted one hand. "Stay inside." Lily disappeared. Mara looked back at the brush. For a moment, the whole place seemed strangely quiet. Then she struck the match. The first flames moved slowly through the dry weeds. There was almost no wind. Smoke crawled along the ground before rising between the trees. Mara watched carefully. The honeysuckle crackled. Dead vines collapsed. A rotten fence post disappeared into the fire. Then something metallic fell from the brush. Clang. Mara stopped. She walked closer. Half buried beneath the blackened vines was an old iron ring. She pulled it free. It was attached to nothing. At least, nothing she could see. She turned it over in her hand. The metal was thick, rusted, and cold. Her grandfather had never mentioned it. Mara slipped it into her jacket pocket. Then the fire moved another 6 feet, and the ground changed, not dramatically, just enough for her to notice. The soil beneath the weeds was darker than the surrounding earth, almost black. Mara stepped closer. She pushed the shovel into it. The blade struck something solid. Thunk. She froze. She moved the shovel 3 inches to the left. Thunk. Again. She scraped away the ash. A flat stone appeared. Then another. Then another. Mara crouched down. There was a pattern. Not random rocks. Not a foundation scattered by time. A line. The stones were disappearing downward. She cleared another foot. A second row emerged. Then a third. Mara's breathing changed. She stood and stared at the ground. The fire was still burning behind her, but she barely heard it anymore. She scraped faster. Ash smeared across her gloves. The stones continued downward. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They were steps. Stone steps, going somewhere beneath the ground. Mara backed away. For 70 years, everyone had assumed the brush behind the barn was simply worthless overgrowth. Her grandfather had never cleared it. Her father had never cleared it. Neighbors had never asked what was there. And now, beneath the ashes, Mara could see at least 6 stone steps descending into darkness. She ran toward the farmhouse. Lily. Her daughter came the back door. What? Mara pointed toward the barn. Lily stared. Is that a basement? I don't know. Mara walked back toward the steps. The sixth stone was visible now. The seventh was partly buried. She knelt and brushed away loose soil. Her fingers touched something beneath the edge. Wood. Old wood. A narrow plank had been fitted against a stone wall. Mara pulled. It didn't move. She tried again. Nothing. Then she noticed something carved into the stone beside it. 3 letters. W. H. And underneath them, almost completely covered by soot, was a date. Mara stared at it. Her grandfather had been born more than 20 years later. Whatever was underneath that barn had existed before her family ever owned the property. Then Lily whispered from behind her, Mom. Mara turned. Her daughter wasn't looking at the steps. She was looking at the barn. The old barn door had swung open by itself, and from somewhere inside came the unmistakable sound of water dripping. Mara slowly stood. She had spent the morning trying to destroy 70 years of growth. Instead, she had uncovered something older, something her grandfather had apparently known enough to leave buried, and now she had to find out why. The dripping stopped before Mara reached the barn. That frightened her more than the sound itself. She stood beneath the doorway, one hand resting against the weathered frame, listening. Nothing. The old barn smelled of hay, dust, machine oil, and rain-soaked timber. Her grandfather's tools still hung from the walls. A broken cultivator, 2 wooden-handled hoes, a rusted crosscut saw, and beneath a sheet near the back wall sat the old Farmel M her grandfather had used for nearly 40 years. Mara pulled the sheet away. Dust rose around her. The tractor was frozen in place, one rear tire half buried in straw. She remembered her grandfather telling her never to throw anything away until she understood what it had been used for. At 8 years old, she had thought it was just something old people said. Now she wasn't so sure. Lily, stay by the door. Her daughter nodded. Mara walked toward the back of the barn. The dripping sound came again. 3 drops. Then silence. She followed it to the wall beside the feed room. There was no pipe, no sink, no water tank, just rough oak boards. Mara ran her fingers across them. One board felt different. Loose. She pressed. The board moved inward. Behind it was darkness. Mara stepped back. She wasn't afraid of the dark. She was afraid of what somebody had wanted to hide inside it. She fetched a flashlight from the tractor toolbox. When she returned, Lily was holding something, a small brass key. Where did you get that? Lily pointed toward the floor. It had been lying beneath the old Farmel. Mara picked it up. The key was green with age. A tiny number had been stamped into the bow. She looked toward the wall, then toward the stone steps outside. The pieces didn't fit. Not yet. She slipped the key into her pocket. By noon, Dale Mercer had arrived. He came through the gate in his pickup, wearing his usual tan work coat and baseball cap. Dale was 61 and had farmed the adjoining 80 acres since he was 20. He looked at the burn patch, then at the stone steps, then back at Mara. For once, he didn't laugh. Where'd those come from? I uncovered them. You sure they're steps? Mara nodded. Dale crouched. He scraped away ash with his glove. The stones were hand-cut limestone, each roughly 3 feet wide. Dale's expression changed. These aren't cellar steps. Why? They're too narrow. Mara looked down. Dale measured the opening with his hands. Could be an old root cellar. Then why does it go toward the barn? Dale didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the blackened ground around them. Your grandfather ever talk about this? No. Dale stood. That's strange. Why? Dale stared at the stones. Because your granddad knew every inch of this place. That sentence stayed with Mara. Later that afternoon, she drove to the county historical office. The woman behind the desk searched the property records. The original land deed was dated 1889, 2 years before the date carved into the stone. The property had belonged to a man named Elias Whitcomb, but there was something stranger. The old survey map showed a structure behind the present barn. Not a barn, a long rectangular building. And beneath it was a handwritten notation. Mara leaned closer. What does that say? The clerk adjusted her glasses. Cold storage. Mara felt a chill. For what? The woman turned another page. Apples, apparently. Mara frowned. There had never been an orchard there. At least not in her lifetime. The clerk pulled out another map. This one was from 1907. A series of small squares appeared behind the building. Rows. Dozens of them. Trees. Mara looked at the burned field. What happened to the orchard? The clerk shrugged. Flood, maybe. Disease. Abandonment. How do you know? I don't. That answer bothered Mara. On the drive home, rain began tapping against the windshield. By the time she reached the farm, the temperature had dropped. The sky had turned the color of old steel. Mara walked directly to the stone steps. Rainwater was running down them, and for the first time, she could see where it was going. The water disappeared between the stones. Not around them. Between them. She crouched. The old steps had been built over a drainage channel. Mara remembered something her grandfather used to complain about. Water always finds the lowest place. She had never understood why he said it whenever they repaired the fields. Now she did. She scraped the mud away. A narrow channel ran beneath the bottom step. It led toward the barn. Mara followed the line with her eyes. Then she saw the same dark soil beneath the barn wall. The old underground system wasn't separate from the steps. It connected to the farm, and it was still working. That night, Mara couldn't sleep. At 1:13 a.m., she got up and went into the kitchen. Her grandfather's old farm ledger sat on a shelf. She had inherited it with the property. Most pages contained ordinary notes: feed purchases, diesel, fence repairs, corn prices. But toward the back, one page had been torn out. Mara ran her fingers over the ragged edge. The next page contained one sentence. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Do not uncover the north steps until the ground tells you where the water went. Mara read it twice, then a third time. Her grandfather had known, not guessed, known. The next morning, she called an agricultural consultant from Ames. His name was Robert Harlan. He arrived at 10. Robert was 47, confident, clean-shaven, and visibly unimpressed by the burned brush. He examined the steps, then the drainage channel, then the old map. This is probably an abandoned storage cellar, he said. Probably? That's what I'd call it, until we expose the whole structure. Mara folded her arms. What would you do? Fill it. She stared at him. Robert continued. You're already carrying debt. You don't need an underground excavation project. Dale, standing nearby, nodded. He has a point. Mara looked at the stone steps, then at the blackened ground, then toward the barn. Something didn't feel right. She walked down the first step, then the second. At the fourth step, she noticed a tiny green shoot growing through a crack in the limestone. It wasn't grass. Mara crouched. A leaf, then another. She touched it gently. Apple. Robert laughed quietly. Impossible. Mara didn't answer. She carefully cleared the soil around the stem. The root disappeared beneath the stones. Whatever was underneath the ground wasn't merely preserving the past. Something was still alive down there. That evening, Mara brought out her grandfather's old soil probe. She pushed it into the earth beside the steps. At 12 inches, it hit stone. At 16, the probe slid through. At 22, it stopped again. She moved 3 feet east. The same pattern. Stone, gap, stone. It formed a tunnel, a buried corridor. Mara stood in the rain with the probe in her hand. She finally understood why the overgrowth had survived for 70 years. The ground beneath it had never truly died. It had been hiding moisture, protecting roots, preserving something. But what? At sunrise, Mara returned to the steps with a shovel. She cleared the 7th step, then the 8th. The darkness beneath the barn opened wider, and at the bottom, beneath a layer of mud, her shovel struck metal. Not stone, not wood, metal. Mara knelt and dug with both hands. A rectangular iron door emerged, and stamped across its center were 4 words: Whitcomb Orchard Waterworks. Mara stared at the name. Then she noticed something scratched beneath it. A date, 1903. And beside the date was a single symbol her grandfather had drawn in his ledger decades later. Mara reached for the latch. It moved. The door opened 1 inch. Cold air rushed up from below. And somewhere underneath the farm, something began to run. The sound lasted 7 seconds. Then it stopped. Mara stayed crouched beside the iron door, her hand still wrapped around the latch. Cold air continued rising from the opening. It smelled nothing like a forgotten cellar. It smelled like wet limestone, like leaves after rain, like soil that had been sealed away from daylight. Dale came down the steps behind her. "What is it?" Mara pointed. He leaned over the opening. His face changed. "That's a water tunnel." Robert Harlan stood above them. "Don't go down there." Mara looked up. "Why?" "Because you don't know whether it's structurally safe." She almost listened. Then she saw water moving beneath the door. Not much, just a narrow stream. It flowed through a carved channel in the limestone floor. Mara watched it disappear into darkness. Her grandfather's sentence returned to her. "Do not uncover the north steps until the ground tells you where the water went." She finally understood. The steps weren't leading to a basement. They were leading to the farm's original water system. Mara opened the door wider. Behind it was a narrow passage with a barrel-vaulted ceiling. Stone walls, brick floor, hand-cut channels. Every few feet, small openings branched away. Dale whispered, "Good Lord." Robert stopped smiling. Mara stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately. Her boots splashed through an inch of water. Along the walls were old iron brackets. Some still held fragments of wooden pipes. At the far end, sunlight appeared through another opening. The tunnel crossed beneath the barn. It wasn't abandoned. It was functioning. For more than a century, water had been moving to the same underground system. Mara followed the channel. Then she saw the roots. They entered through cracks in the ceiling. Apple roots. Hundreds of tiny white root hairs spread through the damp stone. She touched one. The roots were alive. That was when Robert finally spoke differently. "Your brush isn't growing because of the surface soil." Mara looked at him. "It's growing because the roots are finding water underneath." He nodded. "And if that's true—" He didn't finish. Mara did. The old orchard never completely died. They climbed out. For the first time, Mara looked at the burned clearing differently. The weeds weren't random. They had been following the old orchard rows. The wild grape had wrapped around dead apple trunks. The sumac had filled the gaps. The honeysuckle had followed the drainage. The overgrowth wasn't hiding the orchard. It was growing on top of it. Mara walked to the center of the clearing. She pushed a steel rod into the soil. 14 inches. Then the rod struck something. She moved 3 feet. Again, another obstruction. She measured. Then another. The spacing was almost identical. 12 feet apart. Rows. Exactly as shown on the 1907 map. Dale slowly removed his cap. "You've got an orchard under there." Mara shook her head. "No." She looked toward the stone steps. "We have an orchard." That afternoon, Mara began digging carefully. Not with a tractor, not with a backhoe, with a shovel. Every few feet, another piece of the past appeared. A blackened apple trunk, a rusted pruning hook, a wooden irrigation stake. And then, beneath the ash, she found something unexpected. A small metal tag, stamped with a variety name. Winesap. Mara recognized it immediately. Old-fashioned apples were not popular anymore, but winesap trees were known for surviving harsh conditions. Her grandfather had once told her that old varieties could be stubborn. At the time, Mara had thought he meant the trees. Maybe he meant the farm. By evening, the local story had spread. People came to look. Some parked along the road. Others stood behind the fence. One man laughed. "She's digging up dead trees." Another said, "She'll spend 10 grand restoring something nobody wants." Mara kept working. Then a county agricultural inspector arrived. His name was Thomas Reed, 54. He had inspected farms in Madison County for 26 years. He walked the clearing without speaking. Then he knelt beside one of the exposed roots. He touched the soil. His expression tightened. "What?" Mara asked. Thomas rubbed the dirt between his fingers. This soil is unusually dark. Compost. No. He smelled it. Organic matter. He looked toward the stone steps. How deep does that tunnel go? Mara pointed. Under the barn. Thomas stood. Then you may have something bigger than an old orchard. Those words changed everything, because Thomas explained that buried agricultural systems could preserve more than water. They could preserve soil structure, old root channels, fungal networks, even genetic remnants of trees that no longer grew above ground. Mara looked at the exposed roots. You mean the trees could come back? Thomas hesitated. Not necessarily. Then he noticed a tiny leaf near her boot. He crouched. His face went completely still. What variety is this? Mara handed him the metal tag. Wine sap. Thomas looked from the tag to the leaf. That's not possible. Mara had heard that sentence too many times. Why? Because if this rootstock is what I think it is, the original tree may have survived underground. Robert shook his head. Apple trees don't live like that. Thomas looked at him. Most don't. The crowd had gone quiet. Mara suddenly felt the weight of the moment. For 70 years, people had walked past this place. For 70 years, the farm had looked dead from the road. But beneath the weeds, the old water system had kept part of the orchard alive. Nature had been doing something nobody had noticed. The next morning, Mara contacted a nursery specialist. He came with pruning equipment and a portable soil analyzer. After 2 hours, he found 4 living root systems. Then 6. Then 9. They weren't healthy trees. Not yet, but they were alive. The specialist looked at Mara. You could propagate these. How? Cuttings. Mara stared at the twisted roots. Would they produce apples? If they're genetically viable. That single sentence became the new question. Could a forgotten orchard become a working orchard again? Mara didn't know, but she knew something else. The farm needed money. The bank had given her until November to bring the operating loan current. She had no crop ready to sell, no savings to fall back on, and restoring an orchard would take years. That night, she opened the old ledger again. This time she found a loose sheet hidden inside the back cover. It contained a list of names. 23 families. Beside each name was a number. And at the bottom, in her grandfather's handwriting, the orchard fed the county when the banks wouldn't. Mara read the sentence slowly. Then she looked at the names. Some belonged to families still living nearby. One belonged to Dale. She found him the next morning. He stared at the list. My father bought apples from this place. For how long? Dale swallowed. Until 1954. Why did it stop? He looked toward the burn clearing. Because the orchard froze. Mara frowned. The whole orchard? One night. Dale pointed toward the north. Late spring frost. Killed nearly everything. But the roots survived. Dale nodded. Apparently. Mara returned to the steps. She finally understood why her grandfather had never cleared the brush. He hadn't been ignoring the orchard. He had been protecting what remained. But there was still one question. If the old trees had survived underground, why had her grandfather never brought them back? Mara went into the barn and searched through every box. Near sunset, she found a wooden crate behind the old farm lamb. Inside was a stack of glass jars. Each jar contained dried apple seeds. Every jar had a year written on it. 1958195919160196111962. And the last one, 2004. Mara's hands began to shake. Her grandfather had been collecting seeds for decades. He hadn't forgotten the orchard. He had been waiting. At the bottom of the crate was one final note. Only 6 words. Wait until the land asks. Mara looked through the barn doorway toward the stone steps. For the first time, she understood. The fire hadn't destroyed the orchard. It had revealed it. And beneath the ash, something was already beginning to grow. 3 weeks later, the first new leaves appeared. Mara found them just after sunrise. They were small, red at the edges, green in the center, almost fragile enough to disappear beneath her shadow. She knelt beside the stone steps and touched one with a dirty fingertip. Behind her, the old Farm-lamb sat idling. Its engine shook the barn windows. The tractor had become part of the restoration, without anybody planning it. Mara used it to pull fallen timber, haul compost, and drag the worst of the dead brush away from the surviving roots. The machine had spent 60 years working this farm. Now, at 72 years old, it was helping bring the orchard back, but the bank still wanted its money. Mara had 11 days. The nursery specialist had taken cuttings from the surviving wine sap roots, but nobody could promise they would produce commercial fruit. And Mara couldn't wait 5 years for an orchard to pay its first serious bills. Then Thomas Reed returned. He carried a folder. "I found something." Mara wiped her hands on her jeans. "What?" Thomas opened the folder. Inside was a 1911 agricultural report. The Whitcomb orchard had once supplied apples to 3 counties. But the report mentioned something Mara hadn't expected. The orchard's most valuable feature wasn't its trees. It was its water. The underground stone system allowed the orchard to survive dry summers. Thomas pointed to a diagram. The drainage tunnel collects water from the higher ground, then distributes it through these side channels. Mara studied the drawing. So the orchard wasn't planted here because the soil was perfect. No. Then why? Thomas smiled slightly. Because whoever built this understood the land. That was the technical piece Mara had been missing. The stone channels acted like a slow underground irrigation system. They didn't flood the roots. They didn't pump water. They simply stored and redirected it. During heavy rain, excess water moved through the limestone channels. During dry periods, moisture remained trapped beneath the root zone. The trees got water gradually instead of all at once. It was an old idea, but it worked because it followed the natural slope of the ground. The system didn't fight nature. It cooperated with it. Mara looked at the burned clearing. For 70 years, the weeds had been taking advantage of the same water. Now she could use it again. But there was another problem. The old orchard had been destroyed by frost. Mara couldn't change the weather. Thomas looked toward the north field. "You don't have to." Mara frowned. He pointed to the stone channels. "You have water." Then he pointed toward the orchard rows. "You have mature rootstock." Finally, he pointed toward the barn. "And you have a cold storage structure under there." Mara understood. They didn't need to recreate the old orchard. They could rebuild it differently. Smaller, hardier, more valuable. She planted wine sap, Arkansas black, and enterprise varieties, choosing trees that could handle Iowa winters. She used the old water channels. She rebuilt the stone steps. She repaired the underground gate. And she turned the forgotten clearing into an orchard again. But the community still doubted her. Dale stopped by one afternoon. "You know what people are saying?" Mara kept tightening a bolt on the irrigation gate. "What?" "They think you're throwing good money after bad." Mara nodded. "Maybe." Dale watched her. Then he reached into his truck. He brought out an old wooden apple crate, the same kind his father had used. "I found this in my barn." Mara looked at the faded lettering. "Whitcomb Orchard, Madison County." Dale set it down. "My father kept it for 70 years. Mara looked at him. "Why?" Dale shrugged. He said some things deserved to outlive the people who made them. That evening, Mara planted the final tree. It was a wine sap. The cutting had come from one of the roots beneath the stone tunnel. She pressed soil around it with both hands. Lily stood beside her. Will it make apples? Someday. How many? Mara smiled. Enough to start. The following spring brought a setback. A late frost. Temperatures dropped below freezing for 2 nights. Mara woke before dawn and walked the orchard. Every tree was wet with cold. Several blossoms had already fallen. The memory of 1954 suddenly felt close. She could have panicked. Instead, she walked to the stone steps. Water was still moving beneath them. Mara opened the old underground gate. A thin stream traveled through the channels. She understood what the original orchard keeper had understood. The stone couldn't stop frost, but moist soil changed temperature more slowly than dry soil. The underground water bought the roots time. Mara spent the night monitoring the orchard. At sunrise, Most of the blossoms were still alive. Not all, but enough. By August, the first apples appeared. Only a few. 7, then 11, then 23. Mara didn't sell them. She carried the first basket to Dale's house. He stared at the fruit. Then he picked one up. His eyes watered. "My father used to eat these." Mara nodded. Dale took a bite. He closed his eyes. "It tastes the same." That sentence traveled through the county faster than any advertisement could have. By October, people were coming to the farm, not to laugh, to buy. Mara sold small boxes of heritage apples, cuttings, and young trees. The money wasn't enormous, but it was enough. She made the bank payment. Then another. Then another. The orchard grew. So did the farm. 5 years later, the burned clearing was unrecognizable. Rows of apple trees stood where honeysuckle had once formed a wall. The stone steps remained visible beneath the restored barn. Mara kept them exactly as she found them. No concrete, no new railing, just old limestone worn smooth by more than a century of footsteps. The underground water system still worked. The Farmel M still worked too. Its engine had been rebuilt, but Mara kept the original hood. Dale became one of her biggest customers. Robert Harlan, the consultant who had once told her to fill the tunnel, eventually came back. He stood beneath the barn. Then he looked at Mara. "I owe you an apology." Mara shook her head. "You were looking at the farm from the road." Robert smiled. "You were looking underneath it." 10 years after the fire, the Whitcomb orchard covered nearly 12 acres. Mara never became wealthy overnight. There was no miracle check, no mysterious investor, no lottery-like discovery. The farm survived because she worked it. She sold apples. She sold nursery stock. She hosted pruning workshops. She restored the water system. She taught other farmers how to recognize old drainage patterns before burying them. And every autumn, families came to pick apples beneath the trees. Some brought children. Some brought grandparents. Dale eventually stopped calling the place that old brush lot. He called it the Whitcomb Orchard. One afternoon, Mara's daughter Lily, now 18, walked beside her through the original clearing. "Do you ever regret burning it?" Mara looked toward the stone steps. "No, even though you didn't know what was underneath." Mara smiled. "That's why I burned it." Lily laughed. Mara didn't. She reached down and brushed ash-colored soil from a stone. The first fire had looked like destruction, but fire had only removed what had covered the truth. The land had done the rest. It had held water, protected roots, preserved seeds, waded through generations of neglect. And when somebody finally listened, it gave the orchard another chance. Mara had inherited debt instead of dreams. But she learned something her grandfather had known all along. Some land doesn't need saving. It needs remembering. 5 years later, the county placed a small wooden sign beside the driveway. It read, "Whitcomb Orchard, EST 1889. Below it was a second line, "Watered by the original stoneworks. Restored by the Whitaker family." Mara never put her name on the front. She didn't think she had earned the right. She simply kept the farm moving. One morning in October, she opened the barn before sunrise. The old Farmel M started on the first crank. Outside, mist settled between the apple rows. The stone steps were damp with dew. Water moved quietly beneath them. Lily walked into the orchard, carrying an empty wooden crate. Mara followed. For a moment, neither spoke. Then somewhere above them, an apple dropped softly into the grass. Mara looked up. Hundreds of red apples hung beneath the morning light. The same land that had looked dead from the road was alive again. And beneath the barn, hidden beneath stone, water was still moving exactly where the first farmers had taught it to go. The orchard didn't announce its survival. It simply stood there, quiet, patient, remembered. And as the morning mist lifted from the trees, the old stone steps disappeared beneath the soft gold of sunrise.